I'm Korkut Onaran, urban planner, architect, and adjunct faculty in University of Colorado, Denver. And I'm an urbanist. I'm part of the Congress for the New Urbanism. I've been the president of the Colorado chapter for between 2009 and 19. And lately, we had a lot of workshops and discussions about adaptation in the organization. And I'll share some of my ideas. These visuals, by the way, I just showed will make more sense towards the end. So I'm focusing on the quality of receiving places. We had some good presentations earlier, and I want to go into the detail and kind of give a project. So what is the problem? The problem is the vulnerabilities. If we depend on regional systems for our power, energy, water, waste management, and food production, we are really vulnerable because once the supply routes are blocked, even for temporary, we're not getting anything. Once the power is out, we're doomed. So also, if we live in an isolated place, like suburbia, that is to say, all the essential services are 10 minutes, 15 minutes drive away. And when it hits and that driving is not possible, again, we're vulnerable. And that isolation, research after research, we heard that isolation can be fatal. That's our vulnerability. So the easy answer is localization. That is to say, localize energy, localize food production, water storage, waste management. Now, whenever we talk about localization, everybody's like, oh, wow, that's like going back in history. Well, it doesn't have to be that way. You don't need to get rid of the regional system. You need to create concentric scales nesting within each other. For instance, in energy, the household can have some panels and battery, but that's expensive. What if a block could do that for the whole block? What if a neighborhood could do that? And then all those can be nesting within each other. And that's the way to create resilience. The other side of it, the essential services, that means diversifying the local economy. That is to say, finding those services in the nearby. Some time ago, actually, I'll go into that later. Let's go further. So there's a vision. The vision is, imagine a community where most of the essential services are located within walking distance. Wow. All of a sudden, can we do that? Well, I live in Colorado, and there are a lot of mountain towns. Just 100 years ago, when it snowed, and snow meaning 7 feet, 8 feet kind of a snow, the supply routes were blocked. Sometimes a month, sometimes 2 months. And when you look at the way they managed there, zero waste, they grew their food and then stored their food, a very diverse set of small businesses, local, that sustained the life during those months. So we should learn from the past and bring that back. The same thing about the energy, water, waste, and food production. There is a way to localize. And then in this book I published, but it has a lot of contribution of different people to the idea. We looked at the model of a development where we can do this. So, again, 100 years ago, my neighbor, if he or she is a doctor, it was very usual that they would perform a day or two a week from their houses, and then they go to the hospital, right? So that's an amenity. I go to, and see them. Actually, where I live in Longmont, Colorado, my kitty corner neighbor is a dentist functioning from a house. During the COVID, I was so thankful because we know each other, so he accepted me and I had problems. So, when I make this kind of comments, I get usually a reaction that, oh, I hate my neighbor, I'm fighting with my neighbor. Well, my answer is that maybe in the near future, you're not going to have the luxury of hating your neighbor because your life is going to depend on that. That social cohesion is the most valuable thing to increase the vulnerability. But we planners, urban planners, have the responsibility to enable that because we disabled that. We banned that doctor to work from house because that's a residential neighborhood zoning. So, with that, I'm suggesting a model adaptation act. And in today's political environment, it should be a state. You know, in the past we had federal enabling acts, you know, City Planning Act, Zoning Enabling Act in 26, but it's really hard to expect this federal government to come up with that. So, but organizations like these, if we put together a model act, then maybe we can guide some of the states to follow up. What is this? So, what this is saying is that if you create within your community, through comp plans and then the zoning, a zoning reform in a territory called, let's say, receiving zone or receiving resilience zone, whatever the name is. But you define a zone within which you apply a zoning reform, and I'm going to talk about what that is. Then, a state will give you these three policies. And I'll go into the details of what those are. It's a very simple structure. That is to say, it's enabling. It's not mandating. It's saying that if you do this, we'll provide certain things. And the whole idea is a resilient zone with a different quality of life. A quality of life we used to have in the past, and we kind of forgot and undermined, and it's becoming more and more important because of the catastrophes. So let's talk about the zoning reform. First of all, the purpose. You know, we talked about this a little bit in the morning. Financial resilience. You know, all through the history, property produced something. Only in the last 80 years, we created something, an anomaly, called residential property, that doesn't produce anything, just sucks money in. How did we do that? And that made a lot of households very vulnerable for a financial crisis. They lost their homes. So let's turn that around. Let's make property producing something. Create productive ownership opportunities and diversity of neighborhood services. So those are the purposes. And these are the 5 elements of zoning reform. Let me go into one by one. Permit multiple families and unrelated people to live in the same structure. We did that last year in Colorado. State law passed. You cannot require or you cannot control the occupancy and relationship within the occupancy in Colorado now, except fire and building code related. But you cannot create a single family zone, for instance. Why is that important? Because it creates affordability. You rent a room from your house and you gain some value and that person gets affordability. Permit multiple dwellings on a lot. You know, we did these studies without changing the square footage of the total building area. Maybe instead of just one big house that a family needs to own and start paying rest of the 30 years, what if we made it small and multiple structures, multiple units? And then actually, we convinced one of the cities, I mean, my office also revises zoning ordinances for municipalities. City of Golden, next to Denver, we introduced this and then we rewrote their code. And now they're allowing multiple structures, multiple ADUs, so to speak, on a lot. And the comparison is very simple. You know, instead of one big structure, why not we have 3? And then here are some examples of those. These are the, these are in the books now. that, as the lot grows, you have multiple structures and basically what it is called compound. And in our model, adaptation village model, we use that idea of compound as the, one of the elemental building blocks. Here are some of the examples. How can you create a block, for instance, larger block, with a green in the middle by means of several compounds? And this is in the book. Permits small lot subdivisions, clusters. This is another thing. That is to say, there are a lot of, in the existing cities, west and actually all around, originally larger lots and then small structures, and then in time it grew. That, especially in the West, that was a pattern. And we found out, kind of forgot that. That is adding one more structure for something, one more structure for another thing. And again, in the same jurisdiction, Golden, Colorado, we made that happen. That is to say, if you provide certain common amenities, you should be able to subdivide the land with tiny little lots, with tiny little cottages. So that's the third item. Another example here, this is something we did in Utah. And what you're seeing here is that what we call it back-to-back. Again, it's subdivision. That is to say, even though it looks like an apartment building, actually those are fee simple lots. And the owner owns the land as well as the building, and therefore the liability is really low. The whole idea is to really not only increase density, but do it in a way that the ownership is dispersed. And the people owning those appreciates the value. And that's the way to create financial security. And that's the way to create small increments of affordable units. We depend on the giant production builders, and there's always things that we cannot control there. So how do we distribute that? There are some other examples. I'm going to go fast. Fourth item is, we always focus on the residential dwelling units. We forgot that in the past, the businesses were allowed. So in our codes, we bring two definitions. I don't need to get into that, but farming and industry and retail. What we're saying is that as long as they are really small, it doesn't matter. The impact is not that important. We put a 600 square feet tiny little shop and a giant gas station in the same zoning category sometimes. And that's wrong, because those are very different animals. And allowing small retail, that doctor functioning from house, or some, accountant functioning, should be encouraged, not discouraged. First, we should enable by zoning, by these two discussions. And then, in Colorado, for instance, we passed an ADU law, but and state level again, and also housing, but we're really short to get into this really mixture of different businesses. So, and finally, permit rentals. Some zones don't permit rental. Well, you can easily change that. So, the whole idea here is, if you have this zoning reform with these 5 items in the receiving zone, then comes some advantages and help. Again, just to remind some of the purposes. And, in summary, it's enable the hyper-local economies, create them and enable them. So, going back, what are these carrots, so to speak? First is the preferential tax. This is a very, everybody knows about opportunity zones. What if we apply that to small businesses in the receiving zones? Then we're helping that doctor. We're encouraging the doctor to function 2 days from the house. You need the doctor and the plumber at the same time. That's the resilience. That is to say, it's not, we were talking about gentrification, for instance. If you enable properties however how small they are, to produce, then you stand against the gentrification. You know, there was this discussion, gentrification is bad. Well, it's movement towards monoculture, which is exactly what we don't want to do. We want to diversify the business so that we have the essential services around us. So that's first. Tax deduction for rent. You know, we encourage ownership, which is good because there are a lot of advantages in a community building, etc., so forth. But since the U.S. economy depends on the housing and housing prices, if the housing prices don't go up, then the economy fails. It's a very weird thing because we depend on the big industry. Then what happens is that the new generation is having a hard time affording houses. So we need to really make that housing market resilient and the employment market resilient. And that's why it's very important to encourage renting with two conditions. One is if the primary breadwinner of the household lives close to the work. The second is that the landlord lives on the same lot. So we're not talking about the apartments there. You know, we're going to put the affordable housing in 500-unit apartment complex. No. Distribute that to the community so that the wealth stays with people, not just one big company. That's the resilience you need. So that's why it's so important to give that rent deduction where it is needed. And that's just going to create an ADU market. And finally, help them localize the infrastructure, you know, because some of the infrastructure stuff, sewage systems. You know, I just read a EPA report that 5,000 large sewage systems in the US every year fails, meaning that water is polluted. The flood comes in, and you know, especially Midwest and Northwest, we made the mistake of combining stormwater with sewage, and it's so easy for them to fail. And then they fail, that water goes somewhere, right? So, I mean, my recommendation to whenever I go to a new community is like, stop doing that. Require new developments not to extend to your sewage system. Have their own. Because there are a lot of local technologies very easy. And if you need to help them, help them. So that's, and in this particular case, I think state needs to really provide some of the FEMA monies to this kind of thing. So that's about it. Now, when I say hyper-local economy, this guy had this tiny little bug, and he's a coffee shop. He goes, parks in front of the train station and does really good business in Denver, in front of the Union Station. And that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of resilience we need. That is to say, when we need something, the regulation system and zoning should be resilient enough to allow that to happen next to us. You know, I dropped this screw, I need a screw. If I'm in Mexico, there's someone gonna give me the screw in my walking distance. Here, forget about it. It's like, I need to check and find that store, who knows where it is. So that's the kind of resilience we're talking about. We used to have that in the past. That's the whole thing. We need to go back and we are responsible as urban planners, because we overregulated and kind of lost that resilience. And to me, that kind of resilience is very important for the adaptation. So that's the book, that's the other book, the craft. I mean, I'm into form-based codes, yes. So, questions? Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation.
Sure.
Just to frame my question a little bit, I'm coming from a global health background. I'm from the Duke Global Health Institute, and I love kind of the vision of these like communal living spaces, and I can see from like a health perspective how beneficial that would be, knowing how crucial social support and social networks are to not just mental health, this would really help people, but the hardest part is convincing people to change their behavior and to want that. And the U.S. being such a individualist and like hyper, like just very isolationist, individually very people. I'm from Colorado as well, and you know we have like huge suburbs there, like the suburbs of Aurora and Adams Ranch, Middleton. It's like you have these like practically like 1 acre lots, and people like that. People like to have their space, and for a lot of people, the idea of living communally and living with multiple other families is not a change that they're willing to make, even if you can sell them the idea that that would be a more resilient solution long term. So I guess my question is, what kind of steps could you take to kind of convince people to have that behavioral change and to make those decisions to want this kind of lifestyle? And what other like, would you work with like education? I guess it's like how do you have that behavioral change happen?
Good question. You know, more than half of my time in my professional practice was dealing with NIMBYs. And now there's a new acronym, BANANA. Do you know that one? Build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. That's BANANA. And it's not easy. Now, in 2023, Colorado had a bill about housing, and it had a lot of some of the elements of these, that is to say ADUs and increasing densities and getting rid of the single family housing. And it was a mandate. And it was killed because of that. That is to say, a lot of local governments like, are you kidding me? I'm not going to do this kind of deal. So there was a lot of reaction. And then last year, we passed 5 different legislations in the state level. And more or less, some of those elements are still there. My answer to that politically is not mandating, but a system like this, like a block grant. If you do this, if you create that zone, I'll help certain things for that zone. And that gives an option. You know, it's like, if you know, we kind of, you know, it's a joke in our practice that we do these red maps. That means, you know, there are some landmines, NIMBYs, don't go there, don't negotiate that. It's like some zones are very hard to convince, and some zones maybe more open to it. So, you know, this is my personal opinion. If you start creating those zones and showing that the life is much more resilient, not only that, but there's social cohesion. And, you know, we became that much of private only very recently. That's the thing that people know. If, you know, you go talk to some of the grandparents and such who lived through, or, you know, nowadays you can't find one, but go and read some of the stories of the 30s during the Great Depression. It's a completely different social mentality. So, you know, who knows? It may change. That's my personal answer. But the value I see there is really, you know, research after research shows that most of the fatalities, heat waves, floods, etc., so forth, are in the most isolated neighborhoods. If you don't know your neighbors, that's vulnerable. Go ahead.
2 separate questions.
Sure.
First, you mentioned that at least for some components of this, you were having some success in Colorado. Are there other jurisdictions elsewhere in the country where you think that you can see the prospect for taking up some of these ideas? And I guess the second mostly separate question is, you mentioned that you had led the Congress for New Urbanism Colorado chapter. How does your approach here fit with the Congress for New Urbanism platform, so to speak? There are probably people who don't know what the Congress for New Urbanism is, so you might want to explain that.
Sure. The first question, there are some examples. I mean, Utah, to my surprise, we do some work in Utah, have some housing mandates saying that, you know, each community will assess their housing needs and then an action plan. And Minnesota, of course, passed single family related. One very interesting example I find is Hawaii. Hawaii has a state law saying that the big power companies cannot monopolize. They need to allow nesting. I was talking about nesting. That is to say, if a neighborhood wants to have their own solar farm, that needs to nest within the smart grid. So that's, to me, very progressive. Boulder, where my office is, Boulder, Colorado, tried to municipalize the power, and they couldn't after like 8 years of fight. The Xcel Energy won the case, and but anyway. But in the law field, much better what's going on in the States. So I'm sure there are others around that have some interesting state laws. Congress for the New Urbanism, it's a 30-year old national organization. Urban planners, civil engineers, all about city planning and community. And the whole premise is that, we used to create really walkable, compact, socially cohesive neighborhoods in 30s, 40s, and we forgot that in 60s, 50s. How can we regain that? How can we, what are the principles of creating good design? And there's a charter, and I would encourage you to look at that charter. And it's basically for urban planners and designers to follow certain general principles. That's the Congress for the New Urbanism. And within the Congress, we've been asking similar questions for a while. I don't know. It's getting intensified, but so does that answer? Yeah, sure. Any other thoughts, questions, anecdotes? Yeah, go ahead.
This question may be a bit silly, but I'm just thinking at the top of my head. When you're talking about changing zoning laws in a country like America, which is so car dependent, how would you tackle problems that would arise out of parking issues? Let's say one family decides to get one car for each of its members, and it's a family of 5 people. The other family is a family of 5 too, and they want to get more cars, but there are only limited parking spots available. So then, how do you envision that these challenges on a day-to-day basis would be overcome?
Good question. Parking. Last year, Colorado passed a law about parking as well. It's a state law. And what it says that in multi-family and in mixed-use neighborhoods, municipalities in their zoning cannot ask for minimums. That's kind of revolutionary. The whole idea is asking for minimums. It's not the other way around. I mean, there are some communities putting some maximums. That's where you would get that kind of thing. But it's about, you don't have a choice. You need to provide 2 cars. It killed a lot of traditional mixed-use corridors. Because what happened in time is that, you have a bungalow, small bungalow, and all of a sudden that bungalow became a architectural office or accountant office or small restaurant. And that created a really diverse corridor, but you come to 50s, 60s, all of a sudden there are parking requirements. And then, if it happens to be a small restaurant or a cafe or, an intense parking, the minimums required pushed the businesses out. And then we're finally, 5 years ago, I believe, or 6 years ago, somewhere there, got rid of that rule. That is to say, if it's a small lot, commercial, there are no minimums. You can have 0 parking because the corridor accommodates and let the market, it's like if I don't go to that business because I need to park 2 blocks away, then that's business's problem. You know, I personally don't mind. So that kind of thing. Again, in this model, it's a choice that local community needs. I mean, the local jurisdiction needs to make. You know, you have council, elected officials representing the will of the people. If they don't want it, they don't want it. But if they want to try in one zone, those are the rules. As for the parking, actually, you know, parking is so expensive. And again, you know, once you realize how much it drains from your pocket as an average household, then you realize that, is it worth it? Okay. All of a sudden you start asking those questions. The other part of it is that it's a car dependent. If you're car dependent, you're vulnerable as well, because what if that arterial is blocked? If you depend your car to get certain services, then you're vulnerable. That's the whole idea. That is to say, can we find a way, a land use pattern that we need to drive less? I mean, that has been our challenge for a while, but now it's more important because for the first time we started to see the routes are blocked. That never happened in the past, you know. Go ahead.
What about agriculture and small farming, like people who want to keep chickens or keep a neighborhood pig that they give?
Yeah, that definition we put there, like we call it cottage farming because it's not your regular farming, it's less impact. And yeah, that's very crucial. And interestingly enough, it's happening more and more, the urban agriculture, and so forth. But at the same time, there's the other side of the coin. Monopolization of food industry is growing like crazy. Just last 20 years, a place like Iowa, you know, thousands of family farms closed because of the giant meat industry polluting the whole water system. So we're dealing with both sides. You know, yes, urban agriculture is growing. Yes, people are growing in their backyards, etc., and so forth. But related with that, there's one anecdote. I don't know if you're familiar with Victory Gardens in England. During the Second World War, there was supply problems, so food shortage. And in England, the government started what they called Victory Gardens, you know, encourage people and help people to grow food in their backyards. It dropped in few years, 2 years or so, close to 50% of food dependency in England. It was that effective. So, I mean, it's not something to, you know, it's very significant increase. So, yeah, that's part of the whole equation, definitely.
I want to begin by introducing Jeff Peterson. I want to introduce Jeff Peterson. Who is a visiting scholar at the Environmental Law Institute, and he's a facilitator for a coalition of nonprofit organizations working to strengthen the response to coastal flooding along the U.S. coast. That's the Coastal Flood Resilience Project. He is the author of A New Coast Strategies for Responding to Devastating Storms and Rising Seas. Beginning in 1979, he worked at regional and headquarters offices of the EPA and for the U.S. Senate Environment Committee and for the White House Council on Environmental Quality. With that, last but certainly not least for today, and wrapping up is Jeff Peterson. Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Ira, and thanks everyone for coming. Thanks everyone for staying. My job here is to give some closing thoughts. I put some notes together the other day, but I've been editing madly as I listen to everybody during the course of the day, so I've got a few general big picture things I'd like to just share with people and then maybe take a few questions before we break. But the first thing I thought is important to say is that scale is really important. And today we see only the very beginnings of relocation from climate risk areas into receiving areas. But we're seeing a lot more evidence that that's going to grow dramatically. We've heard estimates today ranging from 13 million people relocating to maybe it's 20 million people. First Street Foundation just published a report yesterday in which they're projecting 55 million people relocating in the United States due to climate change by 2055. So that's a big number. That's a big problem. That demands a thoughtful and government-wide response, major commitments, federal financial commitments from the federal government, from state and local governments, and coordination and cooperation between the governments. It's all a very tall order. I think if handicappers were looking at it today, they would probably say the chances of our coming up with a smart solution to this problem were pretty slim. But even with that, I think we have to keep in mind that there's a tendency to think small and a reluctance to think big enough to capture the scope of this problem. We really need to be thinking big. The second big picture observation that I'll offer you is that we really need, in order to solve the problem, to be smart about this, to be a success, we need to understand the problem. And one critical characteristic that I think hasn't gotten enough attention is that we're mostly talking about people right along the coast, leaving and relocating. And yes, there are wildfire-driven relocations. We will see inland flooding drive relocations. But the vast majority of people relocating in the coming decades due to climate change in the US will be doing so because of coastal storm surge and rising sea level. For many people, relocating will not just be a smart financial decision, it will be unavoidable because their property will be underwater. And in increasing numbers of cases, the communities where people are living will also be underwater. So the option of rebuilding on the site and not relocating when you're on the coast is likely to become harder and harder to the point of diminishing to nothing. A related consideration is that relocation from coastal areas will largely be in response to storm surges from major hurricanes. And in those cases, we're dealing with catastrophic storm damage, which has lots of implications for how you would design a relocation and receiving community policy. But just one of them is that people engaged in this process many of them are going to be experiencing pretty significant emotional trauma. They will have gone through a major disaster, loss of their house, maybe major financial destitution as a result. And that whole problem of people being in that state when you're trying to deal with them has to be part of the answer. The third general point I think that needs to be made is that there's a huge money question that comes up at time and time again here. Just a couple of examples. Money in the form of the cost of insurance is starting to drive people away from high-risk areas and to move them to areas where we're worrying about where they're going to relocate. Money in the form of exploding federal disaster assistance costs will motivate the federal government, even under this administration, to take a hand and a closer look at relocation policies. Money in the form of lost mortgage payments and defaults driven by declining property values will generate financial instability, not just in the localized areas, but potentially on a more macroeconomic scale. Money in the form of government revenues will be needed to implement the buyout and related programs that are part of relocation, and money will be needed to implement the policies and programs to support receiving communities that we've been talking about. We're going to need some pretty good economists. Another important big picture point is fairness. If we sort out the money issues, we have to be mindful of fairness and equity. The research on the delivery of disaster aid in particular is pretty clear that there's been a tendency for wealthy people and communities to get greater shares of resources than less wealthy people and communities. Given that there will be limited funds to manage relocation, we need to set clear policy on how these funds are allocated with fairness in mind. Do we fund everybody equally regardless of wealth? Do we fund people or communities with the most limited resources first? And how do we account for historical discrimination? Moving on to another, not quite my last, but almost my last big picture point. Relocation is not just about people and communities. A national effort to support relocation of communities is a great start, but it needs to also provide for relocation of critical infrastructure and ecosystems. In the case of infrastructure, it's not enough to get key assets relocated out of harm's way, away from the coast mostly. New infrastructure needs to go where relocated people are, and we need to be sure that we avoid putting infrastructure in places that would be better used for things like ecosystems. And ecosystems just can't be the last thing that we think about as people shift from risky places around the country to safer places. A key goal needs to be to avoid putting new communities in places that are critical for ecosystems, like the place the beach wants to migrate to. And we need to be remembering that that making new communities attractive to move to will require placing them in the context of a healthy ecosystem. And my last point is that we need to recognize that the challenge of events like today is not simply to sort out a set of smart policies and programs, leaving it to the government and others to implement. That's really it's just not enough, because there are people and organizations who see it in their interest to sustain the status quo and not implement a proactive agenda that would make relocation run smoothly. Without picking on anyone too much, it's worth saying that developers and realtors want to leave things pretty much as they are, regardless of a changing climate. There are politicians who listen to people say they would rather not move, and they see it as their duty to oppose any hint of relocation. Just the other day in the state of Virginia, new law for disclosure of coastal flood risk was turned down by the legislature in response to lobbying from the Realtors Association. We need to be mindful that even the best and smartest policies will be opposed, and that that isn't to say that we should water down positions, but we need to think about understanding the opposition's point of view, and we need to anticipate setbacks and not get too discouraged when things don't go our way. So those are some really big picture observations that I've drawn from today and thinking about this problem. I'd be happy to take any questions before Ira gives us a wrap-up. Yes, ma'am.
So I'm very pleased that you talked about ecosystems, and I do believe that we actually depend on them for air and for water and for food, etc. So what about the cleanup of an ecosystem after a hurricane? Because the waste from houses that have been damaged is very complicated waste. It's very mixed waste, there's a lot of pollution. It's helping that ecosystem to restore itself becomes very important as well.
I absolutely agree, and debris from damaged houses is a problem. Septic systems are often destroyed and need to be completely replaced if you're going to put housing back there. And although we haven't seen it quite yet, but there are major industrial waste disposal facilities in risky areas that will increasingly be at risk of storm surge and sea level rise. Those are going to pose more problems as well. One of the things that I think isn't getting enough attention is that when people do move away, particularly after a storm, many of them will believe that they're selling their property, if they sell it at all, that it's being taken over by the government and it's not their responsibility to